Howdy, howdy. Gary Palmer here with Fishing Oregon Coast podcast. Julie and I visited the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife offices in Newport, Oregon, and talked with Eric Schindler, who's the project leader for the ocean salmon here in Oregon. Eric gave us some insight into that program and fishing for salmon here on the coast. So let's hear from Eric.
Before we start, would you tell our audience a little about yourself,
Okay.
your history with ODFW,
Sure.
and also maybe a little about your personal fishing, and
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Well, I'm a native Oregonian. Grew up outside of Portland in Hillsboro, and I've been working for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife since 1984. Started out as a seasonal port sampler at Pacific City, oftentimes referred to as fish checker, and now I'm, I guess, the head fish checker amongst other things. So I run the project that I started out with. Prior to that, I worked for National Marine Fisheries Service for a few years as a foreign fisheries observer on board Japanese boats.
Oh wow!
Have had a few, in my earlier years, had a few other sidebar jobs within the department doing spawning ground surveys and research projects on returning fall Chinook and some other things like that.
Oh, great! Wow. Yeah. Projections this year, everything's pretty positive. I mean, what we're hearing, it's going to be a really good year for the most part, and should be great fishing for people. So maybe tell us a little about that.
Yeah. Everything is never all positive. So the good thing is I don't think we've got any real negatives this year. So we've got at least even keel on most everything, if not some real strong things. So we're looking at a very, very good hatchery coho forecast for this year. It's giving us some good opportunities for seasons during the summer for fin clip coho, and as well as during the September non-selective coho fishery. We're going to have probably some good opportunity there as well. Chinook, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. The California stocks coming out of the Sacramento San Joaquin Basin, which largely is what we rely on for our ocean Chinook fishery, they're pretty much at long-term average level. Well, obviously, we're a little concerned about the drought conditions down in California, where that may take us. Fish coming into the Columbia River, and most of our coastal stocks are doing good or fantastic for Chinook. Unfortunately, most of those fish go north and don't do much for our fishery down here. So they go up off Canada, they catch a lot of the fish up there, do really well up there. And when the fish come back to the mouth of the Columbia, we usually have a pretty good fishery that develops there as well for Chinook. We get a little bit of spillover to the south, especially for Snake River fall Chinook, and some of a few of the upriver fish come south as well, and hopefully with basically a record run this year. They're expecting the most Chinook back to the mouth of the river they've seen since 1938.
The Columbia. Right?
The Columbia, yeah. So hopefully we're going to get at least a little bit more spillover to the south, and the indications right now have been pretty good. The commercial fishery has been doing very well on Chinook to start off with. They've been primarily offshore quite a ways, so it's kind of outside the reach of most of the sport boats, but we're seeing a few fish come in within the sport fishery already.
That's great. So when you say spillover coming down south, so we fish primarily Winchester Bay, Umpqua, Coos, or Florence. So that's what you're talking about. The fish that they're not coming in. They're going to come up to Columbia, but they go down south and come back up again. Or?
Yeah, even the fish coming out of the Umpqua don't go out of the Umpqua and just stay in front of the Umpqua. They spread out along the coast. Now the Umpqua happens to be kind of the exception to most of our, at least the spring Chinook out of the Umpqua. They tend to do more of a mushroom cloud out of the river and go north and south. Most all of our Chinook socks from the Elk River all the way on up the coast, they go on up off Canada, and they don't do much for our fishery until they come back. Every once in a while, we'll catch some of them when they come back. But like most things in nature, they're not all the same. They're not all doing the same thing. So some of them are going to go one way, even if 99% of them go the other way. There's always going to be a few going the other direction. And so we get some of that spillover, and some runs we see more of them than others. And so the Snake River Falls is one of those that we tend to see them all the way down to Northern California. We see relatively good numbers of snake falls in most years showing up. But the majority of those still go north.
Right. Okay, great. So have the limits been set, the regulation limits?
For the ocean, with the exception of some state waters fisheries that we'll have later in the fall, or likely will have later in the fall, which have not been set, they won't get set until August at the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting.
Okay.
We're expecting something off the Elk River and off the Chetco River, like we normally have. The rest of the seasons have all been set, but yes, there can always be changes that could occur in season. We certainly advise anglers to be aware of that. For Chinook on the Central Coast, and when I refer to the Central Coast, talking about Cape Falcon down to Humbug Mountain, which is basically from Nehalem Bay down to Port Orford. So within that area for Chinook, it's pretty much set. It would have to be something drastic that would occur for us to consider making any additional changes like closing the season or reducing the bag limit or something like that, because we're not under a quota within that zone. Chinook, it's just basically wide open. And further south, it's the same thing. We operate under a season structure. So from Humbug Mountain down to the Oregon-California border, that season is also structured by season, not by quota. Now for Coho, we are under quotas. And so for Coho, we do have a very robust quota for the Central Coast of 80,000 fin-clipped Coho during the season that'll open on June 21st and is scheduled to go through August 10th.
So comparing to last year, what?
Last year, I think we were at 10,500 for the summer season. So we're at 80,000 this year. So we're expecting a very robust run. We're almost 1 million hatchery Coho are forecast for this year. And the vast majority of those are fin clipped, which is a requirement to retain those during that summer season. Beyond that, starting August 30th, we will have a non-selective Coho season that's scheduled to go through the quota of 20,000 or the end of September, whichever comes first. And also, if we don't use all the Coho from the summer fishery, we can roll fish forward to September on what's known as an impact neutral basis. And the impact neutral has to be for lower Columbia River natural Coho. So we have the potential of increasing that September fishery beyond the 20,000 that's currently scheduled for that. And we are going to start that fishery off 7 days a week this year. In most recent years, it's been 3 days a week or something like that to start with until we're confident that we're going to make it. So we'll have to see how that goes. But we're looking at some very good seasons. The Chinook is open through the end of October. And so I know Winchester Bay last year, it was lights out fishing for about 3-4 weeks there, both in the river and in the ocean. So very good fishing down there.
Wonderful,
And Brookings down the very southern part of the state, the last couple of years, they've had very good fishing down there for Chinook. Between Winchester Bay and Brookings, it made up about 74% of all the Chinook landed from the ocean fishery for the recreational fleet last year.
Really? Wow. Wow, that's surprising. So we're having a good year this year. So does that mean anything for the next year or the year after? Or how do you project? I mean, as anglers, we say, wow, enjoy this year because the next year is going to be crappy. Or are there any things that you can project based on a good year this year? Or does it work that way? It doesn't work that way. It's not that
I wish it was. Boy, I wish I could predict next year or the year after.
Because we hear people say there's cycles. Okay, there's a cycle, and it's going to be good, and then it's going to slack off, and then come back again. And
there's some things we know, but they're pretty minimal at this point. Most of the Chinook that we catch on the Oregon coast are coming out of the Sacramento system. Last year, I think we estimated for most of the coast, it was about 70% of the Chinook that we landed.
So they're going to end up the Sacramento River. So they're just coming here. We're catching them, but those we don't catch are going to go back down.
Right, and the Sacramento Chinook are largely 3-year-olds as adults. There's some 4s, there's some 5s, but different stocks of Chinook have different age mixes. And, most of our north migrating stocks of Chinook tend to be 4s, 5s, and 6s, whereas the Sacramento tends to be primarily age 3 with a few 4s. The Klamath and the Rogue tend to be a little bit more of a mix between 3s and 4s, but primarily 3s.
Wow.
And so, unfortunately, since the Sacramento is mostly 3s, and they contribute most of the fish we catch, we can't really predict them yet, because we have to have the 2s, the jacks, that show back up in the river to predict the 3s, and we won't get the jacks until this fall.
I see.
And so we don't have a good sense of that as to where we'll be until this winter, when we get that information on what returned to the river from California. And so we're kind of in a, for Chinook, we can't really say much about our ocean Chinook fishery for next year. Obviously, we're very concerned about the drought conditions in California and southern Oregon.
They're not going to make it up the river because there's not enough water for them to make it up in the upper streams. Is that how the drought?
Well, the main concern with the drought was, as much as anything, the juveniles coming out of the river and making it downstream. Because we didn't have much flow in the river, so that it takes longer for those juveniles to go downstream, which means they're exposed to predators for a longer time, which means they're exposed to disease for a longer time, which means they may get trapped where the water's too warm and have problems. So I know some of the hatcheries down there have been trucking their fish to net pens in the estuary to release them from there, so that they'll get good survival out of those. Certainly the natural adults coming back this fall, it is going to be a concern as to whether or not there's enough water in the river this fall for them to get back. We may not have a problem with it for next year. The year after is when the rubber is going to hit the road as far as that drought, I think, and how it may affect us with those California stocks. But it's certainly a concern. For Coho, we have to see the jacks. Coho are essentially 3-year-old fish, and until we get some of those jack returns, we have no way to really identify really what the population forecast is going to be for next year.
Yeah. So, and the jacks, let me ask you some questions about that. So, jacks, we catch 5 in the river, right?
You catch some 5s, yeah.
5. So, up to 5 days. So, what's going on with the jacks? Are they just mixed up and they're heading up the river too early, or is that? And is there any purpose in them going up the river? And
they go up to spawn. They're just overly excited juveniles, if you will. So they will go up the river. They will try and spawn. They can successfully spawn. And they will die, just like any other adult salmon that comes into the river. I know a lot of people think, oh, well, those jacks, they'll come in and then they'll go back out. They don't. They come in, they spawn, and they die, or at least they try and spawn. They have to find a female, obviously, that's either going to accept them or be able to slip in there when the adult is not paying attention, which is often the case. And it can be very comical going out and watching the dance, if you will, with the spawning salmon on the spawning grounds, and watching the jacks try and dart in there when 2 males or larger adult males are fighting and things like that. So, they are trying to spawn. They've come into the river because, they're ready. And they're ready to go. And, the proportion of jacks varies a little bit depending on which run and the feed conditions that those fish may have gone through, if they mature early enough to come in or not. So,
but the limit of 5 is that they're really not serving a purpose going up the river. Is that why, or they're?
Well, they do serve a purpose. You don't want to entirely discount jacks. I mean, there's a reason that they're there, and part of the reason really is that if you've got a female in the river, you want to make sure that you've got something to spawn with it.
So they might.
They can, yeah. So that may be your only source of male if the run goes down low enough, and so you get more jacks into a system, or they may spread out more, and you're going to get some spawning. The female's not going to be lonely, and a male will spawn with more than one female. So.
Okay, so you start out as a fish checker, and now you're the head fish checker But what are most of the violations you'd find? I know that your people don't do the rest, but they'll call the state police.
Yeah, we're not, well, I mean, one thing that I guess want to make clear is we're not out looking for violations.
No.
And my crew, we're only going to deal with a violation when it comes up and slaps us upside the head, and we have to deal with it.
Okay.
You know, so my crew, what they're going to typically run into, that'll be violations, which are almost always mistakes. You know, the intentional folks are game enforcement officers from Oregon State Police. They're the ones that are going to be more likely to catch those. And there's a number of other violations that they oftentimes are running into. But the things that we're going to run into at the dock that are going to be a problem is if misidentification of a fish, where they bring in a prohibited species, or a short fish, one that's sublegal. And for Coho, the minimum length is 16 inches. For Chinook, it's 24 inches in the recreational fishery. And for steelhead, it's 20 inches. And that's all from the ocean. So those are the main things. So, you know, sometimes somebody will bring in a Chinook that they thought was a Coho, and so it's shorter than the minimum length.
Right.
It's more of a problem where people bring in a large Coho thinking they've got a Chinook when the Coho season's closed.
Yeah.
So those are the typical things. Sometimes with bottom fish, they'll bring in a yellow eye rockfish or a canary rockfish, both of which prohibited.
Yes.
Cabezon, we now have a season period on Cabezon with a one sub limit on Cabezon. And there's length limits on some of those other fish as well. Lingcod and Cabezon and greenling all have length limits. So those are the typical things. You know, on bottom fish, every once in a while we'll have a situation where somebody miscounted and brought in too many fish.
Right.
You know, so those are the ones we're going to deal with. At the dock, we're not looking at hooks, so we're not looking for barbed hooks violations, things like that. We're not going to check tags unless we already have a violation for some other reason. But that is something that state police checks, and they are out at sea boarding boats, and they'll check your line. If you got a barbed hook, you may have a problem.
We can check number of times.
And making sure that people tag their fish on their catch record immediately. And state police will pull right up and check your tags, and if you've got fish and they haven't been tagged already, then you're going to have a little chat at the very least. So, but yeah, my crew isn't out there looking for violations. We don't like finding violation. It gets in the way of what we're trying to do, which is to get the information that we need to make the catch estimate. So hopefully everybody keep their nose clean and we don't have any problems.
We hope so too.
Yeah.
So too. So with the information that they're gathering, sometimes they'll take the snout and they'll send it in, and Julia will usually ask for the code or the number, and then what happens with that information?
Okay. Those are called coded wire tags that are buried inside the snout. That's the type of tag that we're looking for from the ocean salmon fishery. And the coded wire tag is about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters long. There's different sizes of them. And on that tag is labeled, etched in by a laser, a number. That number corresponds to a release group of fish. And unlike a lot of other tags with fish, there may be 200,000 or 300,000 or so of the same tag number that are in the ocean from a release group. And so all the fish maybe, or part of the fish from a hatchery release, all get tagged with the same number. They're all released at basically the same time from that same group. And those tags then, as we collect them from both the sport and commercial fisheries in the ocean, as well as back at the hatcheries, that gives us the ability to go back and kind of reconstruct the runs, look at the distribution of catch in the ocean. So for those tags from the ocean, it helps us to identify which stocks are where at different times, and helps us to model seasons and get it as fine-tuned as possible to allow the greatest opportunity for both sport and commercial fisheries in the ocean to access as many of those fish as we can. And it usually comes down to 1 or 2 or 3 groups of fish that we end up having to be limited on. For us, usually for Chinook, it's Klamath River. Fall Chinook is what limits most of the Oregon coast in the recreational fishery. And for the most part on the Central Coast, as you see, we've got a March 15 to October 31 season this year. We're pretty much not limited this year. We've got a good wide open season. And for Coho, it usually has to do with Oregon Coast natural Coho or lower Columbia River natural coho. In parts of the coast, it's also the Rogue Klamath mix of coho. And for the most part, our restrictions this year are based on the lower Columbia River natural coho production. That's what's really limiting our fishery and has for the last several years.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So those that don't have that, you're using averages, and maybe talk about that. So we were talking about counting boats, and then also the doing sampling as the fish come in.
So a coded-wire tag, I mean, there's a certain number of coded-wire tags that came out of a release group, and you know, through the sampling, they're going to get a percentage of those tags, and we expand for the sampling rate. In most of our ports, we're sampling between about 30 and 40% of all the fish that come in. Some ports we sample more, some we're pushing closer to 20%, which is a minimum goal. We want to get at least 20% of the fish that are coming in sampled.
And how do you know that? By boat count? Or?
Our catch estimates and effort estimates are made by counting the number of boats, recreational boats that are going out in the ocean, and then interviewing boats as they come back. And we don't interview everybody. We get a proportion, as I was saying, basically usually 30 to 40% of the boats coming back in. And what we get from the boats is we get an average catch rate. And so we'll interview a boat, we'll find out how many people are on board or fishing, we'll find out what they've caught and what they were trying to catch. And then that helps us to parse out that information in the end. So we'll take that catch rate, and the catch rate is actually at the boat level. And so if there's 4 fish on a boat and 5 anglers, we're really just taking those 4 fish for the boat, and we're looking at our percentage of boats that we sample and the number of boats that went out to estimate the total. So if there's 100 boats that went out and we sampled 30% of them, we're going to be expanding basically by a factor of 3.33 in that case.
So do you feel, you've been doing this for a lot of years, do you feel that it's pretty accurate within, do you?
When you look at sampling programs in almost any scenario, we're sampling at a much higher rate than most sampling projects are. I mean, there is variance around the estimate. It's not perfect by any means. I can tell you for sure that our number is not the right number. But hopefully we're very close, and that's our goal, is to try and get as close as possible. We're managing under the best scenario that we can. So I've got a lot of confidence in our numbers. We review it. We've been reviewed by various federal panels in the past, by the General Accounting Office at one point in time back in the 80s, more recently by the National Science Foundation, or National Science Council, something like that, as well as we're oftentimes being looked at by National Marine Fisheries Service and others, to evaluate what we're doing. And we do go and make corrections when we can find, or I shouldn't say corrections, but improvements to the project as far as how we might develop a better estimate to get to where we want to be. We don't want to overestimate and we don't want to underestimate. We want to be as close to reality as we can with our catch estimates. And I think we're there. But I'll tell you, we are always looking to see, is there something that we missed? Is there a gap? And every year there's a problem somewhere that we go back and review.
I have a question about, so when Julie and I go halibut fishing, which we hope we're going to do Thursday and Friday, so we know we can't keep the lingcod, but could you keep a salmon?
Yes.
You decided, so if we get our halibut, we're coming in, hey, let's do some salmon. So that, you can do that.
Within the halibut fishery, they've got special restrictions to limit basically say if it's an all-depth halibut day, for the most part, you can't keep any ground fish. There's a couple of exceptions to that. That would be Pacific cod and black cod, or sablefish. And if you catch those while you're halibut fishing, you can keep them. We don't get very many Pacific cod out here. If you're fishing really deep water, you might get some sablefish. But for the most, that's basically it for ground fish. And the reason for that regulation was that we had some problems where we basically were hitting our groundfish quotas early in the year and having to close groundfish because everybody on these big halibut days, everybody that was going halibut fishing was stopping on the way back in and catching some groundfish. And we're under limits on everything, basically.
Yeah.
And so the groundfish, we had to, well, one of the options that was discussed by the public was, well, how do we avoid this? And, how do we avoid closing down for basically the bottom fish, the last thing that we've got on the table? We don't want to close that. We want to have that open all year if at all possible.
Yes.
And so this was one of the alternatives that they adopted to try and avoid that problem. Because if you've been here and been out halibut fishing,
Yeah.
it's a big fishery. And a lot of boats go out. And so if you want to catch bottom fish on those days, the other thing you can do is you can come in, drop your halibut off and go back out. But the halibut can't be on board the boat when you go out and go bottom fishing. We do have a fair number of people that'll do that.
Yeah.
The other reason that we don't want to have it tied in with the offshore halibut fishery is that there's some stocks of concern out there. Primarily, it's yellow eye rockfish.
Yes.
And we have very, very low allowable impacts on yellow eye rockfish.
Right.
And so trying to make sure that we limit that as much as possible is really important. And if people are stopping on their way in from halibut fishing, they're more likely to fish a little bit deeper, where there's more yellow eye. Right. And so that would be a problem, because even if you catch and release them, a portion of them are going to die.
Yes.
We've got a lot of people now using release devices,
Yes.
descender devices to get the fish back down to depth.
Yes.
With rockfish, they have a gas bladder that will expand or rupture. Basically, the fish are getting the bends. You bring them from deep water where there's pressure, you bring them to the surface,
Yes.
and they expand and they can't swim back down. If you use a descending device and get them down 60 to 100 feet of depth, they'll recompress and they'll be able to swim away and survive
We carry
most of the time.
Our boat, yeah.
Yeah.
There, yeah.
So that's been a real positive in recent years.
It is.
Um,
It is.
So we've seen a lot of people adopting that. Charters are adopting it. Was at a meeting with some of the charters here recently, and I know one of the charters spoke up and said, the passengers on the boat love to do this.
Yeah.
They like to take these devices and put the fish back down to the bottom. They're excited about it. And they're having fun doing it, as much fun as when they're catching fish. So, that's great. We like to see things like that. It's conserving the resource. It's allowing us to have longer seasons and not get into the bottlenecks like where we are with yellow eyes. So,
Yeah. So if you're out bottom fishing and you have seven bottom fish and 2 lings, so you're limited in both of those, can you still salmon fish? And
yes, with a caveat.
Okay.
And the caveat is you can only fish in areas where you are possessing fish that are legal to have in that area at that time.
Okay.
And since we have a 30 fathom closure outside for bottom fish for most of the year.
Yes. So Eric, tell us about the fish ID tags.
Well, with fish identification and salmon, what we really want people to make sure that they're focusing on is the lower jaw on all the salmon. You can identify all of the salmon species we've got by just looking at the lower jaw. The 2 most predominant species people are going to run into are going to be Coho and Chinook.
Right.
There are some chum salmon that show up every once in a while. I know we've had a couple of chums come in recently in the commercial fishery, which is also a hook and line fishery. It's just like sport fishing. So, some people get confused and think we're dragging nets around out in the ocean for salmon, and we're not.
Yes.
It's all hook and line. Pink salmon, this isn't a pink salmon year. Pink salmon usually show up off the Oregon coast in odd numbered years, and we haven't really seen any large numbers of pinks in a long time.
Yeah.
But all the fish can be identified, all the salmon can be identified by just looking at their lower gum line.
Okay.
And if people are out there and they see one of our fish samplers or fish checkers, they can ask them for one of the salmon ID cards.
Okay.
We also have this information and a lot of other information available on our website on how to identify salmon. But we really want people focusing on the lower jaw. And the things you're looking at are the color on the outside of the base of the teeth, at the base of the teeth, and on the inside of the base of the teeth, as well as what the teeth are like. On chums and pink salmon, the teeth are dull and loosely set if they're even there.
Yeah.
With Chinook, Coho, and steelhead, the teeth are going to be sharp and they're going to jab your finger if you run your finger over
Yes.
them. So there's and there's some other tricks to helping to identify salmon. But what my crew, for any ocean salmon that comes in,
Yes.
we definitely want people looking at that lower jaw and focusing on that. And right at the gum line is important.
Okay, great. I'll put links to this in the show notes,
Okay.
and also your contact information for the department and how they can get updates. And you have a means for people to get texts.
We
updates,
do. We do. There's a link on the top of our Ocean Salmon web page, one of the top links there, where people can click on that and they can go to a site to register for, it's a listserv type program that people can get notified either by email or text message to their cell phone. And if people have trouble getting on there and getting logged in, they can send me an email. My email's listed at the bottom there, and I can register them for those notifications. And that's the biggest thing there. Really, what we're sending out through that system is just changes to the regulations or critical updates. And we have a big public meeting in the spring, and we try and make sure people know about that. So if they want to come and give us their 2 cents on how they want to see the season structured, or get the advance notice on how it's looking for the year, they can come to that meeting. It's usually the last week in February. And we have a lot of folks show up. We don't get a whole lot of recreational people come into the meeting. It is a full day meeting, and so a lot of people don't want to spend their day off coming to a meeting and spending it there. But we do have a few sport folks that show up and throw their 2 cents in, as well as the charters and commercial folks that show up.
Sports fishermen that care about salmon fishing, that love it, and they want it to continue for their children or grandchildren even. What can they do? How could they get involved? What can they do to help to ensure that we're going to have a salmon fishery in the future?
Well, I think first and foremost, I mean, if they're out there fishing, do their best to release fish carefully when you have to release a fish. If it's a rock fish, try and use a descending device to get it back down. The other thing is to make sure, if you do get checked by our crew, to report what you actually did on the trip. How many fish did you release by species? And cooperating with our crew to get those code wire tags and get the counts on the fish that we need to look at. And we basically get counts on everything that's coming across from any individual boat. So even if it's down to herring that you jigged out there, or sardines or something like that, we want to know what you've got, and we roll that in. We're not restricting people on herring or sardines, certainly at this point in time, and have no plans to do that. But that information is all important to have in the long-term database to help us show really where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And to help us manage better, so that we don't end up in a situation where we have to restrict things more than we need to.
Right.
So that's the first thing. And then there's obviously other volunteer projects that are out there. And certainly coming to the meetings when you can, and putting your 2 cents. We're sending a text message, well, not necessarily a text message, but an email to the Pacific Fishery Management Council with your thoughts on the season season structure after the alternatives for the season come out in March. Are all helpful. We have a public hearing down in Coos Bay most years that's tied into the salmon season development. All those things are important. And then, if you're somebody that's got lots of free time and you want to get more involved, there's almost always some open seat in the Pacific Fishery Management Council process for salmon or groundfish or tuna, or at least coming to the council meetings when it's in your neighborhood, which isn't very often. It's oftentimes in California or up in Seattle. But trying to get there and participate in that, and make sure that your advisors that participate from the recreational fishery know what your thoughts are. because they're, they oftentimes, they're set in a particular port, and they oftentimes are thinking about what goes on in their port. And so if you're from someplace else on the coast, letting them know. Currently we have Mike Sorensen, who's a charter boat operator out of Newport, who's one of the Salmon Advisory Subpanel members, and the other is Richard Heap, who's out of Brookings. And so Richard tries to get input from other parts of the coast, but he's focused on down on the very south coast. So, he's not always in tune with what's going on in Garibaldi or Newport even. And so getting those thoughts to those folks, and they're very good at carrying those forward and trying to, at least consider other people's thoughts for their local area and try and wrap as much of that into the mix as we can.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks for the job you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Manage our fisheries. Thank you. All right, that's it.
Well, that's another episode of Fishing Oregon Coast. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching this video. If you head over to our website at fishingoregoncoast.com, I'll have the show notes for this episode. And also, if you subscribe, we'll send you a notification every time there's a new episode published. Thanks again. Over and out for now.